10 historical fiction and adventure books that you can use to travel the world. Because if you're like me, you love traveling, but you can't spend 365 days out of the year traveling to different countries all over the world. I wish. So to make this list, I picked countries that I've never visited, but I've always wanted to visit, and tried to find a book for each country, either a historical fiction book or an adventure book. And just to be clear, these are books that I researched for my own personal TBR, meaning I have not read them yet. But I thought you might want to have a little fun with me by traveling the world with me with books from my and maybe your TBR. So let's start with Ireland. I've always wanted to visit Ireland, never have. So for Ireland, I picked Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. So this is a historical fiction book. It takes place in the 1980s in Ireland. And at least from the description, it looks like it has a lot to do with maybe some dark secrets with the Catholic Church. Anyways, this book, along with Claire Keegan's Foster, it's gotten a lot of really good hype over the years. Both of them are very short, so I'll probably just end up reading both of them. I'm very much looking forward to them and looking forward to one day traveling to Ireland. Another country that I've always wanted to travel to but never have is Poland. My grandpa was actually Polish, and if you look at my 23andMe, I'm Polish, along with Czech, Lithuanian, and Russian. But anyways, I've always heard that Poland is kind of like the secret place that Europeans go. It's not as crowded in terms of tourism as a lot of other places in Europe, and I've always wanted to go. So I thought one book that I could use to learn about Poland is the book Poland by James Michener. So James Michener, he's known for these sweeping epic tales, these multi-generational stories where he talks about, certain families over several generations, and he uses these families to talk about the history of certain places. So one of these books is the book Poland. Now the next country is Mexico. I have been to Mexico, but I've never been to Mexico City. I've always wanted to go to Mexico City. And I tried finding books specifically about Mexico City, but I couldn't really find anything. And if you know of one that's good, that's like a good sweeping historical fiction epic that centers in Mexico City, please let me know in the comments down below. But I do know of the author Luis Alberto Urrea and his book, The Hummingbird's Daughter. It's got a lot of really good reviews. It's got a lot of hype. It takes place in Mexico in the late 1800s, just before the Civil War that breaks out there. And it's about a girl who becomes a saint. She actually rises from the dead. And this event takes place amid all the other historical events that are happening at the same time. And it sounds really interesting, and I'm specifically very much looking forward to reading this author. Next up is Japan. Japan is a country I've always wanted to go to. I love Japanese food. I love everything that I've seen about Japan, and everyone I've ever known that's gone to Japan has been like, you gotta go to Japan. It's the best country. It has the best food in the whole world. So I've always wanted to go to Japan. So a book that I've always kind of toyed with reading is The Tale of Genji, which is a really, really old book. It's considered by many to be the first real, modern novel. I had initially thought Don Quixote was the first modern novel, but apparently The Tale of Genji is actually earlier. So The Tale of Genji, it's really about, court intrigues in early Japan. And the thing about this book is that it is huge. I think it's over 1,000 pages. And while I don't want to commit to 1,000 pages, I did recently see on a bookstore that I follow on Instagram, they were actually advertising what they said was the best abridged version of The Tale of Genji. And I actually thought, wow, that is actually a great idea. Maybe I could just read the abridged version. It's only about 400 pages, maybe a little bit less. To me, that feels like a little bit, easier thing to tackle, especially as I am going to tackle Don Quixote this year, which is really long, and I'm actually reading The Three Musketeers right now, which is also really long. I've got some other long classics that I want to read this year, so I just don't want to commit to that. But maybe I can commit to the abridged version. Next up is Greece. I always wanted to visit Greece. It was hard for me to find just one book about Greece that I would like to read, because obviously Greece has all the Greek mythology that, all the retellings of the Greek mythology. So for this one, I chose Corelli's Mandolin. So this is actually a World War II novel talking about what happens in Greece, and I've actually never really read about that before. So that was interesting to me. It's about when the Italians, they invade Greece. There's a woman on the island. She is the daughter of a doctor, and she gets involved in an intense relationship with the Italian commander who is in charge of the army that invades Greece. I believe this was actually made into a movie. So it sounded really interesting to me. I think I found it on some, website by Rick Steves or something like that as a good book to read if you're thinking about traveling to Greece. So I thought, you know what? I don't have any near plans to travel to Greece, but it is on my bucket list, so maybe I should read this book. Next up, Australia. I am actually planning on going to Australia this summer because my best friend moved to Australia recently. She actually managed to get a work visa in Australia. So she now lives in Australia, but she's been back and forth through Australia her whole life, and she's always told me, you've got to come to Australia, you've got to come to Australia. Well, now that she lives there, I'm going to go to Australia with my family. We're going to visit in the summer. We're gonna go to Melbourne, or I guess as they say it in Australia, Melbourne. Melbourne, they don't say the orn part, at least that's what she told me. We're gonna visit Melbourne and Sydney. But the book I chose for Australia is The Light Between Oceans. Now this story is about a couple, a man who came back from the Western Front and his wife, and they live on an island that has a lighthouse, and they're having a hard time starting a family. And then one day there was a ship that washes to shore, and there is a dead man inside and his baby who was alive. And because they've had such a hard time starting a family, they decide not to report what happened and basically just take the baby and raise it as their own. So this book is about the consequences of what happens because of this decision. So it sounds like a really interesting book, and I will read it before I go to Australia. Next up is China. I would really like to visit China. My kids can actually speak Chinese, so in addition to me just wanting to visit China just because, you know, I've always wanted to, it would be fun to go there to see, you know, what my kids' language skills could do in real life. So the book I chose for China, because much like Greece, China has so much history, so you're like, where do you even start? You know, one of the early, you know, river populations, right? They started in China. So I thought I might actually try a fantasy book for China, because there's a podcast that I really like called What Should I Read Next? And the woman who runs the podcast, she doesn't really read much fantasy. I'd say her reading taste, well, it's not, you know, super similar to mine. At least she does a good job of like explaining what her taste is. And she doesn't typically read much fantasy, but she recommended this fantasy book, so I thought, you know, I am trying to broaden my horizons. So A Song to Drown Rivers by Anne Liang. It's actually based off of a famous Chinese myth. She said she really liked it. There was a lot of nuance to it, which I tend to really like when I'm reading a book. So I thought, you know what? Why don't I try to broaden my horizons and learn about China at the same time? Now, Iran is another country that I would like to visit one day. My husband's actually Persian. He doesn't want to visit Iran. His dad was from Iran, and he said he would never go back to Iran as long as the mullahs were in charge, and he never did. He died before ever returning to Iran. And my husband's kind of got the same opinion. At the same time, I've always kind of been intrigued to go there. My husband has family there that travel back and forth all the time. So I'm always like, well, why don't we just go, you know, stay with your aunt and uncle? But, you know, so far I haven't convinced him. But The Stationery Shop by Marjan Kamali, this is one that I've had on my TBR forever. I feel like I should just pick it up and read it. As far as my understanding is, this is a book about, you know, the one that got away. And it sort of centers around the Iranian Revolution. So, you know, until, you know, my husband agrees to go to Iran, I'm probably just gonna have to read about it in books. Argentina is another country that I've always wanted to visit. Now with this book pick, I kind of cheated a little bit because I do love adventure writing. You know, there was a point in my life when I basically read the entire archives of Outside Magazine. I love that kind of writing. So there is a famous adventure book by the author who wrote The Little Prince, and I won't attempt to say his name here because I know I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but the guy who wrote The Little Prince, he's got a famous book about his time as a pilot. He was a pilot, and this book isn't just about Argentina. It's about traveling all over the world in his plane, but he does have some famous scenes about his flights over Argentina. So I'm kind of going to squeeze that one in and sort of kill two birds with one stone. And then last up is Kenya. As a runner, I've always wanted to travel to Kenya. I remember when I was in high school, my coach would always say, train like the Kenyans train. Train hard, win easy. And I actually used to work for a company that owned a group of magazines, and I would always, like, every year sort of lobby for them to send me to Kenya so that I could write about how do the Kenyans train. I wanted to go to I-10 Kenya, which is about 7,000 feet in elevation, and I wanted to, you know, talk about, like, what is the training like? I mean, I know that's kind of a niche topic, but sadly, my lobbying never worked. They never spent the thousands of dollars that would be required to send me there. And there's lots of books about Kenya that I would like to read, but again, I'm going to kind of kill two birds with one stone and read another famous adventure book that's related to Kenya. I'm actually reading it right now. It's called West with the Night by Beryl Markham. Now, this was published in the late 1930s. It is a memoir. This woman, Beryl, she is actually like a badass. I think she was the first woman pilot in East Africa, and it's a memoir. It's just a book about her life as a total badass, and I'm really enjoying it so far. So that's it. I hope you have some books that you can put on your TBR. And if I've mentioned any countries that you would also one day hope to travel to but never had, I hope these books can help you get there, at least in your mind. And as always, happy reading.